It's time for Lumley Live, where history and politics collide.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Now, here's your host, a man who can name all 45 U.S. presidents while flying an airplane and chewing gum at the same time. Jim Lumley.
Stand by in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Lumley Live. Today I'm honored to have a special guest, historian Jack Stanley. Jack, welcome to Lumley Live.
Thank you.
Well, let me give a quick bio to the folks because we're just introducing you to Lumley Live, but I'm hoping that you'll be a regular guest because you and I have had many really great discussions on American history and U.S. presidents.
Yes.
Jack is a former professor in the history department at New York Prep School in New York City. He worked at the Edison National Historic Site in West Orange, New Jersey, researching Edison's collection of private books. And that included Jack interviewing Theodore Edison, Thomas Edison's youngest son, over a several-year period. He started the Thomas A. Edison Historic Recording Project, including doing recordings with President Gerald Ford, Senator Bob Dole, New York Mayor Ed Koch, and others. His television appearances include the History Channel, CBS Good Morning, ABC News with Peter Jennings, and PBS. He's been a guest speaker at colleges, universities, museums, and historical functions. So, Jack, a question that I often get asked when people see this collection I have of American history and U.S. presidents is, how did I get started, or what started my interest, and I'll ask you the same, in presidential history?
It all started with me with the crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Being around my family, my grandfather was a World War I veteran. He kept me enlightened as to how things worked militarily. And we watched everything. We watched Kennedy on television looking stone-faced about the fact that we might go to war. When it finally ended, which we didn't understand the whole story, which we wouldn't know for many years, Kennedy came out smelling like a rose. And I looked at him as a great hero. And he really started my interest in the American presidency. And I've studied it ever since.
One of the best books I have in my library, I have a whole shelf on Kennedy, is this one from Richard Reeves. It's thick. It's not an easy read. It'll take you several months, but it's a great book. And he goes into great detail, several chapters on the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It was an amazing period of time. And I was very fortunate to talk to a lot of people who happened to be there at the time. I got to talk to Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's brother, Ted, and a number of other folks. And it was such a surreal moment.
Wow.
And it could have had profound consequences.
Pivotal moment in history. And of course, the movie 13 Days was an excellent movie. I think
yes, it was.
Yeah, it was pretty.
One thing just to mention real quickly, I just happened to think of this. I got to interview the secret messenger between Khrushchev and Kennedy, who was an opera singer.
Wow.
And he carried messages back and forth. Yeah. No one would guess an opera singer. It was really quite fascinating.
Mr. Johnson, what would you like to be when you grow up? Well, I was thinking about opera singer, but I would rather be a messenger between a Soviet communist and an American president.
Yeah, we'll talk about that another time.
We will, but we're going to harken back today to the election of 1800 and 1824 and 1876. Now, we just had a presidential election here in America, a close one that is in part is still controversial, but that's nothing new in history, is it? We've had some close controversial elections in the past.
Sure have, and 1800 is no exception.
Well, so it's interesting. So we start our country, we have the Revolutionary War, we have the Constitution, and Washington, of course, is sworn in as our first president. And I always say, to me, Washington's greatest contribution was that he quit. He resigned. He stepped down and relinquished power. And then you have a smooth transition of power with his vice president, John Adams. But then the election of 1800 comes, and John Adams, of course, the Federalist, right? A Harvard graduate, one of our awesome founding fathers. In fact, I have the book stacked up here: Adams, Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Rutherford B. Hayes, and I have one up here, The Forgotten Presidents. But So we get this election of 1800, and Thomas Jefferson, the vice president, decides, "Hey, I'm going to run for president." So you have this three-way contest between, Aaron Burr from New York, Thomas Jefferson, the tall redheaded lawyer from Virginia, and the incumbent president, John Adams. Take it from there. What do you remember about 1800?
It was an absolute disaster because you had Alexander Hamilton, who was a Federalist, supposedly on Adams' side.
Yes.
Doing everything in his power to destroy Adams.
And he's currently in the cabinet.
He controlled the cabinet.
He's a holdover from the Washington administration.
Yeah. Yes, he is. He's a very brilliant guy, but dangerous. Thomas Jefferson has a history of doing his best to destroy anyone in his path, going all the way back to Washington's administration. And he hires individuals to smear the name of John Adams, to destroy his credibility, to destroy his entire existence, all the time feigning ignorance. Meanwhile, James Madison, who is connected at the hip with Thomas Jefferson,
fellow Virginian,
is also working with all the newspapers to make sure they destroy Adams.
Now, here's
it's
what's
a two-front war.
So, John Adams, aside from the Alien Sedition Acts and the fact that he could be grumpy at times, he was an honorable man, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And
Yeah,
that was the thing that Jefferson counted on.
Wow.
He knew that Adams would always be honest and honorable. Therefore, he could always skirt around him and just do something really nasty. And the thing is, here's the most amazing part, is the fact that Thomas Jefferson, behind the president's back, totally worked at destroying the administration. I mean, in a sense, you could kind of call that impeachable. What he did was there's no vice president in our history who has been as deplorable as Thomas Jefferson. And the interesting thing is, you have James Madison, who is his aide de camp. Yeah. And as I mentioned, they're kind of joined at the hip, and they're very careful at destroying all the evidence. Yeah. And what they do to protect themselves, they wait till they're old. Fortunately, they live long. And they totally changed all of their diary notes and their personal papers to make themselves look good.
And edited cover up.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And here you have Aaron Burr. Everybody thinks Aaron Burr was bad. He's sitting there going like, what the heck's going on here?
Right.
You know? and he is being destroyed as well, not only by Jefferson, but also by Hamilton.
Right.
And that's why Hamilton and Jefferson hate each other. It has nothing to do with party. It has to do with personality.
Interesting.
They're so similar.
And we still see that.
It's an amazing thing. I found a few things to share with you.
Love to see it. And I'm going to introduce you to my book that I have, a statistical history of the American presidential elections.
Here we are.
What do we have there?
This is the newspaper that was used by Jefferson and Madison to destroy Adams. It was called the American Aurora. And if you look at the name here, you'll see Benjamin Franklin Bach. And also over here, you will see the name of Matthew there. Those are the two founders of the newspaper. Benjamin Franklin Bach is Benjamin Franklin's grandson.
I thought so.
And he falls into the Jefferson camp. Yeah. And they print everything to destroy John Adams. And when the Alien and Sedition Act comes out, Benjamin Franklin Bach is imprisoned and dies of typhoid and becomes a martyr to the cause. It's an amazing period of time. On the other side of the coin, you have this. This is from the same period of time. You'll notice it's a Federalist newspaper.
Because the two major
There's no such thing.
The Federalist Party and then the newly formed Democrat Republicans, right?
They were just called Republicans at the time.
Okay.
They were just Republicans and the Federalists, and each had their newspapers, their organs, as they called them. And these were designed to be partisan and destructive.
Okay.
There was no reason to tell the truth. Truth had no reason whatsoever.
Yeah.
But the whole thing is, while this is all going on, you have this faux war with France. And John Adams is trying to solve it diplomatically. Alexander Hamilton wants to be the general. He loves being the general. And he wants to go to war. And Adams says, with what? We don't have a military. We don't have a navy. And you want to go against France? Who's going to help us? England? You know, it's insane. And so what happens is that John Adams sticks himself devotedly to solving the French issue, and he does. He has a peace settlement set, opens up a dialogue, and this opens up the way for what will become the Louisiana Purchase.
And while this is going on, you have the young John Quincy Adams, who, you know, was mentored by Jefferson, lunched with Lafayette, dined with the Duke of Wellington. He was mentored by Ben Franklin. He's kind of in the background of all this stuff as a young ambassador.
Yes, he is, because George Washington had nominated him as an ambassador and said he is the most important person we have in government right now.
He spoke 5 languages.
Yeah. He spoke, yeah, it's amazing. I got to spend some time in his library.
Up in Quincy.
It's fascinating. Yeah, it's in Quincy, Massachusetts. It's fascinating when you sit there and you look at what he did. He truly was his father's son.
He was.
Because John Adams was indeed in a party all by himself.
Yes.
He wasn't truly a Federalist. He was John Adams.
And he was
who was above party.
A statesman, not a politician. He was grumpy.
Yeah.
He wasn't friendly. He wasn't one to reach out and shake hands. And
he's the most human of all of our founders. If you think about it, he let everything go through. He saved everything. Whereas all of the others were building their foundations for their memorials.
And then John Adams was short, pudgy, and kind of balding. Standing next to the picture, you know, I have the portrait here of the signing of the Declaration of Independence by John Trumbull, and you see the picture of the kind of pudgy, balding, short John Adams, and in the middle of the Committee of Five there is the tall, handsome, red-headed lawyer from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. Jack,
Jefferson was 6'2".
6'2". Jack, do you think most Americans realize how fragile our republic was during those first couple of decades?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And it was. I mean, it was, in many respects, a lot of times when people ran for election, they weren't quite sure they'd ever get a chance to do it again.
Yeah.
I mean, it was that tenuous. I mean, everyone was totally absorbed in what they believed was right. And that's why you had these varying views. And you had people that were willing to destroy anything to make sure their view was captured.
Wow.
And fortunately, we had Adams. Adams stubborn. He doesn't listen to anybody, and he stays the course. And had he listened to Hamilton,
a little bit.
yeah. And had he listened to Hamilton and gone to war with France, this nation wouldn't have survived. There's no way.
Oh no,
we didn't have any allies to come to our aid.
Amsterdam had money, but they didn't have equipment.
Yeah, they weren't going to send anybody. But I mean, England was not going to help us. And to fight France, who was one of the greatest powers in the world, was insane.
The French Empire. Yeah.
And what is interesting, a lot of this all focuses around the revolution in France.
Right.
And in Philadelphia, which was the capital at the time, there were riots, there were fights, there were alien press, all in Philadelphia, trying to cause a situation where the United States would come and fight.
Yeah.
This is the reason for the Alien and Sedition Acts. We don't sedition, excuse me. So that'll put you to sleep. The Alien and Sedition Acts. The fact is that there were so many riots in Philadelphia, and so many articles that were totally fake in these newspapers that they had to get some sort of control. And it was sort of like, in a sense, the Patriot Act in many respects. If you think about it.
Yep.
You think about what Lincoln did, same thing.
Yeah.
And you think about what Wilson did, what FDR did, right down the line after 9/11, we did the same thing.
Yeah, interesting. So on the election of 1800, most people don't realize these elections didn't last one day. They lasted from like October to December. But when the electors are counted, here's what we have. And then I want you to enlighten our viewers with a little bit of history on the original Electoral College. We have Jefferson with 73 electors, Burr with 73 electors, and Adams with 65. So what was the Electoral College back then before the first time we tweaked it with the 12th Amendment?
Well, it was a bit of a circus, actually, in many respects. And it was also an old boys club. You had the various legislators and legislatures nominating the people who would vote.
Yeah, the electors, they're actually human beings. There's people.
Yeah, they are. And of course, they are fierily, very strongly partisan.
Yeah.
Also, the fact is that you had people working in the background to confuse them. Alexander Hamilton, he wrote a 65-page pamphlet just totally destroying John Adams, who was on his side.
In the administration, yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is that the Republicans find it and they publish it.
So, as we know, people didn't go vote in elections until 1824. So the presidents were selected at that time exclusively by electors that were nominated by state legislatures. Mm-hmm. And so they cast this. We have 73, 73, 65. So Adams is out. Now, I think at that time you needed 99 to clinch the presidency. Yeah. So the two top getters fall short. So it goes to the House of Representatives, right? Right.
And that's another mess. I mean, there are 36 votes.
Yeah, I have it here. The 36 ballots.
Yeah, they're tied. The thing is that a lot of people don't like Jefferson. And they're not too fond of Burr either, actually, in many respects. But Hamilton gets into the fray. And he's the one that pushes to get Burr pushed out and let Jefferson in.
Absolutely.
Because Hamilton is a little scared of Burr. Burr's a little bit smarter than he is. Yeah. Every time that Hamilton does something to destroy Burr, Burr outwits him. And also, Jefferson is terrified of Burr, too, because he can destroy his Virginia plan. His idea is to create a dynasty of various individuals, which will happen, actually. Yeah. And that's very much a part of the 12th Amendment, is to make sure Burr doesn't get in there.
Now, I want to remind viewers that at this point, presidents were inaugurated on March 4th of the following year. This was before the 25th Amendment. So this contest, Jack, 36 ballots went all the way until February 17th. So we have the election sometime in the late fall, right? And then you don't get to the 36th ballot in the House. And you know what I just noticed, Jack? Jefferson actually lost 2 electors, even though he wins in the 36th ballot. He lost 2 electors from Virginia, but he picked up electors from other states.
Yes. He picked up, actually, Federalists.
Yeah.
Through the pushing of Hamilton. I mean, Burr kind of looked at it this way. I mean, he said, you are the older, you take it, I will follow. And of course, Jefferson, of course, said, yeah, not in your life. And as soon as this is over and Jefferson finally is declared the winner, he does everything in his power to destroy Burr. He does everything in his power to destroy anyone who could possibly challenge the Virginia dynasty.
Yeah, including Burr goes on and runs for governor of New York a bit later.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, okay, so we end up having President Thomas Jefferson, and as we know, the outgoing president John Adams decides not to go to the inaugural on March 4th of 1801. He slips out in a coach at the crack of dawn. It was a fully loaded coach, and people were smirking, and he kind of griped at him. "What are you laughing about?" You know, and so did the electors make the right choice? Was Thomas Jefferson the right president? What kind of president would Aaron Burr have been, and would we have done the Louisiana Purchase?
I think we would have, and I think he would have been a better president, to tell you the truth. I think I have always, and I've had arguments with lots of historians over the years.
I bet that's a loadful there.
It's usually if I was sitting in, I look at it this way: if I was in a lake and I was drowning, and on the shore was Jefferson, Hamilton, and Burr, Jefferson would look and walk away. Hamilton would help if there was an audience. But I would expect Burr would have the decency to do it. And Burr always does. Burr is anti-slavery. Burr is for women's rights. Burr is for the poor. He does all the stuff that creates basically what's Tammany Hall, to take care of the poor and indigent. Wow. He is totally way ahead of his time and scares the living daylights out of Jefferson, Hamilton, and that whole gang who don't believe women should have rights, who actually believe in the right of having slaves. Yeah. It's a very frightening thing. I think had we had Burr as a president, I think we would advance greatly, much more so than we did with Jefferson. Because Jefferson did the embargo and totally destroyed the economy.
Perhaps we would have avoided a civil war then, if with Burr, an anti-slavery president like Burr in the White House so early.
It would be interesting. I mean, slavery could have been finished off during Jefferson's administration.
All right. So
when you did the Louisiana Purchase.
One of the neatest things I always talk about is the Constitution, which you heard me say many times, and those who are watching, the greatest governing document ever devised by humankind, not perfect, but the greatest. And one of the reasons, Jack, is because of Article 5, the amendment process. Mm-hmm. So after this election of 1800, we decide, hey, we've got to amend the Constitution and tweak the Electoral College with the 12th Amendment. Explain maybe over the next 2 minutes in layman's terms, what the 12th Amendment did.
Well, it solved a big problem that nobody in the Constitutional Convention
they never envisioned that. Yeah,
they never envisioned
political parties,
and political parties were born in George Washington's cabinet. Yeah, you had Hamilton, you had Jefferson, and eventually that broke to the Federalists and to the Republicans, and it worked very well with Washington and Adams. And then the second time, Washington and Adams. But then the third, you had Adams and Jefferson, who couldn't agree on black, couldn't agree on white, couldn't agree on anything. Yeah. And it ended up being a disaster. And the same thing happened, of course, with Jefferson and Burr. Jefferson hated Burr. And Burr eventually realized that and did his best to mess up Jefferson. So they pushed for the 12th Amendment. I'm not sure if it was for the most sympathetic causes. I think it was more to destroy Burr than anything else.
Interesting.
But it solved a big issue, which is that a president and a vice president will run as a party, as a ticket.
Correct.
And that's very, very important because you need the support of the vice president. Yep. And if you have a vice president that completely disagrees with you, they will become basically a cancer within the administration, which is exactly what happened with Adams, with Jefferson.
So we have this tweak of the Constitution via the 12th Amendment, and then we have Madison and Monroe. those elections were fairly smooth. In fact, Monroe could have been elected unanimously, but one elector withheld their vote because they wanted Washington to go down in history as the only president elected unanimously, right?
Yeah.
But then we get to this election of 1824. So at that point in 1824, as you know, the path to the presidency seemed to be you had to have on your resume Secretary of State. If you didn't have Secretary of State, you need not apply. So now you have Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who's going to run. You have the Treasury Secretary. There's a total of 4 candidates in that race. But then come riding into town on his white horse, the famous general from the War of 1812, the man who single-handedly defeated the British Navy at the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. So you have this 4-way race. Then we get to this creates another controversial election, big time. Crawford.
You know, what's really interesting about this election is they're all from the same party.
Yeah,
there's no Federalists left. The Federalists exploded during the War of 1812.
Yeah,
I mean, they had the Hartford Convention, and they just went the way of the dodo.
The Federalist Party is dead. You have William Crawford, who's Treasury Secretary, and then you have Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, right?
And then you have John Quincy, who's Secretary of State,
right,
and Andrew Jackson, who had been a senator and, of course, a famous general. Right. And he was known as the man of the people.
Yes.
This is a totally new thing, okay? And so you have these 4 individuals. You have Clay, who is very popular in certain areas.
Yeah.
And you have Crawford, who is a Jeffersonian.
Yep.
And he goes all the way back with Jefferson. He is very pro-slavery, and he has a big stroke.
Right.
And he is somewhat incapacitated. That didn't stop anything. They just kept going. And when they had the election, nobody got the right amount. I mean, no one got the proper amount of electoral votes.
Let me give you the amount real quick. I have the book here. So you got Jackson, 99 electors, Adams, 84, and then 41 for Crawford and 37 for Henry Clay. So the Constitution says the top 3 get to go to the House for selection.
And here's the interesting thing. It goes to the House of Representatives, and who's the Speaker of the House?
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay.
Yeah. And by the way, he hated both Adams and Jackson.
Yeah. But he hated Jackson more.
You know why? He said someone who slaughters 2,500 British soldiers should not be president of the United States.
So, I mean, it becomes a basically mudslinging like crazy in the House.
It does.
I have an article here from the New Hampshire Statesman, and it's talking about John Quincy Adams, and it says some people think he's a closet Federalist. That's a scary thing. And Crawford offered Adams the opportunity to be his vice president. And of course, Adams said, fiddle-dee-dee to that. I'm going to go for the thing. Clay and Adams have a secret meeting.
Yeah.
And nobody really knows what is talked about. The interesting thing, John Quincy Adams is a confirmed and strong diarist. He constantly keeps a diary.
Absolutely.
He doesn't write a blessed thing during this whole period of time.
Wow.
An interesting thing. I'm like going, okay, that's kind of a little bit of a smoking gun.
Sure.
Because he has been groomed to be president since he was a child.
So
he feels it's his right.
So tell us what they announced the next day, which has the Jacksonians fit to be tied, a corrupt bargain, a deal with the devil.
Yeah, Adams announces that good old Henry Clay will be my Secretary of State, which in those days was the stepping stone to the president.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And of course, they cried foul, corrupt bargain, all that stuff, but Jackson never challenges it. Yeah. Interestingly enough, but he promises, I will get even.
I will be back.
And 1828,
Yeah.
in some ways makes 1824 look like a nursery school. I mean,
it was a blowout. It wasn't even close.
yeah, it was horrendous. And the Jackson people said lots of things about Adams, and Adams said lots of things about Jackson. What Adams said was pretty true. What the Jackson people wasn't really true, but it worked. And
It did.
And that got rid of the old school. The whole idea of the presidency totally changed with Jackson.
It did. And you know what? It's what I learned in my study of John Quincy Adams' presidency was during his whole 4 years, the Jacksonian Democrats, who had a majority in Congress, did everything they could to disrupt his presidency. Any legislation was dead on arrival.
Yeah, he didn't get anywhere. It's an unfortunate thing because he was very much so ahead of the curve. He wanted to build universities, universities around the country. He wanted to build observatories to study space. He wanted to build museums, roadways, canals, the whole thing to advance the nation. And everything he did was dead on arrival. You're right.
I often describe John Quincy Adams as our first true liberal. He wanted to build canals and infrastructure projects. And at that time, there was no appetite for anything other than a military and the patent office.
Yeah.
If there was a patent office.
Yeah, there was. It was fascinating. Just a quick little aside, real quick. Of all of our presidents, there's only one who has a patent. Lincoln, yeah. For floats on a boat. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. All these geniuses we've had, none of them had patents.
All right, in closing, Jack, let's move to 1876. This is the last controversial election we'll cover in today's broadcast, but this is after the Civil War. So think about it. You have 4 million newly freed American slaves. Reconstruction is taking place in the South. There's federal troops that are keeping an eye on the Democrats. Black Republicans are being elected. Hiram Revels, Joseph Rainey being elected senator. In places like South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi. And then you get to this election of 1876. This is after Lincoln and 2 terms of Ulysses S. Grant. But the election is tight. Tell us about that.
Well, during the Grant administration, corruption was rampant. It was frightening. Also, they started lessening up on the states in the South. And by doing so, they brought about what we call Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And there was all kinds of poll taxes and everything else, anything possible to keep blacks from voting. Blacks were almost totally Republican at that time.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And so when the election took place, it was very, very close for the Democrats, and that told the Republicans right away, wait a minute, something's wrong here, because automatically we should get a lot of extra votes in the South.
Yeah, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina.
Yeah. And so they did some investigating and found there was massive fraud going on. And so instead of correcting the massive fraud, they just added to it. And they created their massive fraud, which in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, which all had Republican governors. They said, take care of it. And they did. And they figured if they got those 3 states, that's 1 more electoral vote than Tilden.
185.
Also, they started a smear campaign against Tilden. Tilden was a bachelor who collected books and liked wine, and they stated that he was a little less than masculine.
Interesting. And he was the governor of New York.
He was the governor of New York. Neither one of these individuals, Hayes or Tilden, were exactly exciting people. They were duller than a kitchen knife. Okay,
There's a picture back here of Rutherford B. Hayes. He reminds me of the guy in Home Alone.
Yeah, he looks like one of the Smith brothers, selling cough drops.
So,
but the thing is that neither one of these individuals gets anyone excited.
they don't.
And it's battled out. and they bring in they made a vote. This is the craziest thing. In the House, they came up with this vote. We're going to create a panel who's going to vote.
Right. So
Republicans,
right,
or Democrats.
so they create this special commission. In other words, the past election of 1824 went to the House, and the House, for the Constitution, cast a vote. Why this remedy with a special commission instead of the normal constitutional path?
Because they wanted to. It's really bizarre. I mean, it's never been done again.
No.
I mean, we've had some interesting things in 2000.
Yep.
But the panel was set up with 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and what they considered an independent.
Yeah.
That was actually initially the Supreme Court Justice David Davis.
Okay.
He was the guy who got Lincoln in, and how they got Lincoln into the presidency. They created fake tickets and they did all kinds of stuff like that. So he came in, as soon as he got in, he got elected and became a Republican.
Right. So now you have.
And so he had to leave, and they brought in another guy from New Jersey. But nonetheless, the guy from New Jersey was a staunch Republican.
Yeah.
And they battled it out. And after they looked at all the evidence, the Republicans voted 5 and the Democrats voted 4.
Yeah.
And Hayes was nominated.
He gets
the deal was, here's the deal.
Yeah.
We will take the presidency and we will remove everyone from the South, and you can do whatever you like.
That was a horrible
The
compromise.
unfortunate citizens down there.
Horrible compromise. Yeah. And
it was awful what was done.
now, 2 things before we get into that a little bit more. So the New York Sun actually said Mr. Hayes is not president, and the voter turnout, Jack, in that election of 1876 was 81.8%, an incredible.
Massive.
Even though you have these boring candidates, you have a really big turnout. Why do you think the big turnout?
There was a great deal of fear after the Grant administration. Here's the interesting thing. They were announcing in the press that if the Democrats don't win, they're bringing an army to Washington, D.C.
Wow.
to invade and place Tilden in the White House.
Wow.
Now, Grant took this seriously. He brought the military to Washington, had gunboats going up and down the Potomac.
Wow.
And everyone was really on edge that we could actually possibly start a civil war again. I mean, it was that ugly. And what was really ugly was in the House of Representatives, half of them were packing heat and wearing guns, and they were pointing them at each other and threatening each other.
On the House floor.
On the House floor. In fact, there was a Republican that went up to a Democrat who was arguing, and the Democrat said, "Remove him or I will." and no one was shot, but it's quite an amazing thing. The intimidation factor was insane.
Yeah.
And so what you had was basically corruption placed upon corruption. And the Democrats said that the Republicans were corrupt, and the Republicans' answer was, we saw corruption and we just added to it.
Yeah, to even it out. So
yeah, it's amazing. I mean, this is a book that was written right afterwards. It's called A Political Crime. It was written by the Democrats.
1878?
Yeah, this is actually written in the 1880s after it was all said and done with.
Okay.
And it basically talks about what happened. And it was a frightening period of time. You know, it's an interesting thing as an aside. I was driving down the road in 2000 in November. And, you know, years ago, the press used to understand everything about history. They don't really know their history too well anymore.
No, unfortunately.
And as I was driving down, they announced that there was a problem with the election. And there were votes in parts of the South, like Florida and Louisiana. They said, nothing like this has ever happened before. And I almost crashed the car.
I screamed and started yelling at the television set. So what happened is you got Rutherford B. Hayes, who's this Ohio Republican governor, pro-civil rights, but as extending a hand of compromise or an olive branch, he says, we're going to pull all federal troops from the South. And as you said, that began 85 years of Jim Crow, lynchings, the KKK, Bull Connor, you name it.
It's horrific.
It is.
What that actually created. And it was, and no one really cared. The Democrats or the Republicans. They didn't.
I know. Sad.
Didn't care at all.
That was consequential, wasn't it, Jack? I mean, that is one consequential presidential act. Yeah. All right.
And it left a absolute void that would not be refilled for a century. I mean, if you think about it, Martin Luther King, when he gave a speech in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial, said, "We've come to deposit a check."
A promissory note.
Yes. And it was returned saying insufficient funds.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a fascinating, I wish they'd say that more often in that speech, because I had a dream is great, but this first part is so important because it says exactly what happened. We defaulted.
We did, and the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship to Black Americans, and then the vote. He was saying those are a promissory note, and we've been a little patient, a little too long here. It's time to deliver.
Sure.
And he was right on target. Well, Jack, this is a great discussion. Let's do it again, okay?
Okay, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah.
It's great to sit and chat about this stuff because, we don't talk about these things too much.
We don't. And I learn from you every time we get together and have a discussion. You fill my brain with details.
We learn from each other.
Okay, historian Jack Stanley, our guest today on Lumley Live. Thanks again, Jack.
Thank you.
You've been watching Lumley Live. History and politics. Conversations that make you think, listen, and learn. Lumley Live is a production of POTUS America. Made in the USA.